I'm Tracy Sable. Tonight on EWTN News Nightly, fighting for the faithful. Lawmakers demand answers from the Biden administration over a major military hospital's Catholic pastoral care. Disturbing weekend. How the Archdiocese of Boston is responding to the city's hosting of a Satanic Convention. Long-awaited trip. A preview of the Holy Father's upcoming visit to a majority Christian country. And all bets are off. A closer look at the controversy over sports gambling. These stories and more tonight.
From EWTN, the Global Catholic Network, this is EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you for being with us. Our top story tonight, new this evening, Republicans are demanding answers from the Biden administration. This after a major U.S. military hospital canceled a long-standing contract with Franciscan friars who minister to veterans and U.S. service members. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales joins us now with the latest on a story we have been following right from the beginning. Eric?
Well, good evening, Trace. You know, Republicans, they're not letting this one slide. Many have written to Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin demanding answers. They want to know why this contract was stopped. For nearly 20 years, Franciscans have been ministering over at Walter Reed Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland. They've been able to help many of the soldiers there. But what's worse is the cease and desist letter actually came just hours before Holy Week began.
I think this is outrageous. You know, this is one of the best hospitals for our military men and women, and not to have the chaplains available through the friars is just, how dare they do this?
Republican Congressman French Hill has yet to receive a response from the Secretary of Defense. He tells EWTN News Nightly, quote, "As a devout Catholic, these actions were unimaginable. Patients at Walter Reed should have access to the proper Catholic services, as this goes against our fundamental First Amendment right to the free exercise of religion." Catholic Senator Pete Ricketts praised the church's ministry in hospitals.
The Catholic Church does a lot of work in being able to help people recover their health, and we've done this probably longer than any other institution in the world. And so why we're being excluded from Walter Reed is beyond me.
The contract for pastoral care at Walter Reed was instead awarded to a secular, for-profit defense contracting firm. Senator Ted Cruz told EWTN News Nightly he was not surprised by the administration's actions. Quote, "A Catholic president would so eagerly trample on the First Amendment rights of our fighting men and women at Walter Reed. We need answers from the Department of Defense as to why the contract for Catholic pastoral care was allowed to lapse."
We as Catholics are seen as the enemy by the Biden administration. Despite the lip service he plays to his own faith, the entirety of his administration is profoundly anti-Christian and anti-Catholic.
I have uncovered more than a dozen Republican lawmakers have written to the Secretary of Defense, and so far none of them have received a response. But I'm going to stay on top of this very important story for all Catholics. Tracy?
All right, Eric, we know you will. I know House Republicans passed their budget and deficit reduction bill yesterday. So what's next?
Well, the bill now goes to the Senate, but Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has already said that it is dead on arrival. Now, Republicans hope that their bill will be able to open up some sort of communication between the White House and Speaker McCarthy, because as of right now, they've been waiting for the White House to give any sort of response and want to be able to have some sort of talk about this. As we know, both the Treasury Secretary and many economists say that America has until mid-June. Otherwise, if they don't raise the debt ceiling, we could default on our bills.
All right. Thank you, Eric. Well, the state visit for one of America's closest allies continued today. South Korean President Yoon Yeol arrived on Capitol Hill this morning as both nations celebrate their 70-year alliance. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reports. Owen?
Tracy, good to see you after a fancy dinner last night with President Biden. Lots of standing and cheering and clapping today just down the street from here at the U.S. Capitol. On Capitol Hill with Vice President Kamala Harris presiding.
Members of Congress, I have the high privilege and distinct honor to present to you His Excellency Yoon Yeol, President of the Republic of Korea.
Yoon thanked lawmakers for passing a resolution marking the 70th anniversary of the alliance between the U.S. and South Korea.
Your support has dignified my visit. I know that no matter where you sit, you stand with Korea.
And he paid tribute to all Korean War veterans and their families, sons and daughters, husbands and wives.
You answer the call to defend the freedom of a country across the Pacific.
Also today, the U.S. economy slowing sharply from January through March, decelerating to just a 1.1% annual pace. But consumer spending, which accounts for about 70% of U.S. economic activity, remains resilient. President Joe Biden, reacting to the GDP report, said the American economy remains strong as it transitions to steady and stable growth. And in the White House press briefing room, Karine Jean-Pierre tells reporters,
avoiding default is a constitutional obligation Congress has to the American people. That is their obligation, not to us, not to this president, but to the American people.
Earlier at the White House,
thank you all you kids, for bringing your parents to work.
President Biden welcomes kids for Take Your Child to Work Day.
What's it like being president?
What's it like being president? Well, first of all, it's probably the greatest honor anyone in America can have bestowed on them.
Back to the economy now. As for fears of a recession, well, many economists still expect one to hit. Meanwhile, inflation is still pummeling American wallets as rates remain high. At the White House, Owen Jensen, EWTN News Nightly.
A lawmaker in Montana who identifies as a transgender female has been barred from the House floor for telling colleagues they would have, quote, blood on their hands for voting to ban so-called gender-affirming care. Zoe Zephyr also allegedly incited protests in the House chambers this week. Republicans say those demonstrations place lawmakers at risk. Zephyr is the first Montana lawmaker to be barred in around a half a century. Well, the Archdiocese of Boston is calling for intense prayer as the city prepares to host a so-called Satanic Convention this weekend. Organizers say the event, known as Satan-con, celebrates the history of a group that denies the existence of God. It also protests religious symbols in public spaces. In response to this weekend's convention, the Archdiocese says that it has increased the availability of Eucharistic adoration and other Catholic devotions. We go now to Bishop Mark O'Connell, Auxiliary Bishop of Boston. Your Excellency, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. First off, I'm curious, what did you think when you heard that this event was taking place in Boston? What was your first reaction?
Well, I was, as everyone else, I'm taken aback. Now, we happen to have a satanic temple in our archdiocese, not ours, of course. But so it's not the most unusual thing for us, but it is still very sad that they want to hold the largest satanic gathering in the history of the world, they say.
And what more do you know about this group that's hosting this event?
Well, what I've heard, I don't know them, haven't reached out personally, but what I've heard is they don't consider themselves evil. They consider themselves a religion, and so I guess I have to respect that they don't mean violence. But nevertheless, when you're playing with Satan, you have to be wary, and so we all need to pray for them who are literally playing with the devil.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And Bishop Mark, have you heard from the faithful about this event? Are they concerned about this?
Well, right from the beginning of this announcement, we've had people reaching out to us saying, do you know about this? And they're worried about this. So yes, people are worried about this. So that's why we have a whole strategy of how we're dealing with it throughout our whole archdiocese in the region.
Yeah, and not only is Boston hosting an event with Satan in the name, I guess the event is reportedly sold out. What does that signal to you?
There's a lot of confusion in the world, and a lot of lost souls. And hopefully, through our prayer, through our efforts, some of them will find a better path.
And I'm curious, what's the Archdiocese doing, in the wake of this event as far as initiative, prayers, advice for the faithful? What can you tell us?
Well, Tracy, this is not the first time something like this has happened. Not a convention, but other things like this. For example, famously, there was a black mass proposed a few years ago, and we reacted in a way that was we thought best, which was to counter it, to more protest, to send people there. And that did not work. It draws attention to it, and it gives it sets people in their path. Mm-hmm. So right from the very beginning, Cardinal Shan and I have directed that we are not encouraging anyone to go or to protest outdoors, but to go to the places of prayer. Now, in our archdiocese, we have many shrines and churches, and we've gathered all that want to do this. And we have over 45, probably over 50 places of worship, shrines and churches that are doing adoration, that are doing the rosary. And so instead of directing people there to protest, we're directing people throughout our whole archdiocese for places to pray and to counter it with prayer and not give in to what we presume they want, which is attention, which is what happens when people go and hold silence.
Bishop Mark, for those that aren't, in the Archdiocese of Boston up there, but want to pray, what do you suggest? How can we take part to kind of counter this and also pray for those lost souls?
Well, first of all, if they're in the area, we on our website, the Archdiocese of Boston, we certainly have a list of all the places we're opening for prayer, and some of them they're praying throughout the whole 3 days. We have prayer going on the entire time with dedicated people. So you can find that on the website of the Archdiocese of Boston, and I think that is the healthiest thing to do. I like to try to participate in God's plan to bring good out of every evil. From the cross, we have the resurrection. Well, from this strange event, I'm advertising all of our shrines and leading people to beautiful sanctuaries to pray. Hopefully, they'll find it a beautiful place and want to go after too.
That's beautiful. And thank you so much for speaking with us about this. We appreciate it. God bless you. And we have a lot more still to come here on EWTN News Nightly, including when in Rome, why the Prime Minister of Ukraine met with Pope Francis, and a Holy Weekend. We preview the Holy Father's trip to a majority Christian country. Tonight regarding aggressive action from Beijing. Today it emerged that a Chinese Coast Guard ship blocked a Philippine patrol vessel near the South China Sea. The standoff nearly resulted in a collision. Both sides say they were attempting to assert their right to sovereignty in the area. A catastrophe was avoided only after the captain of the Filipino vessel reversed course in order to avoid contact. Pope Francis met today with the Prime Minister of Ukraine. The government official was in Rome to attend a meeting on how to rebuild the war-torn country. He and the Holy Father exchanged gifts. The Prime Minister also asked for help finding Ukrainian children that he says were kidnapped by Russians. The Kremlin strongly denies the charge. Pope Francis is set to leave tomorrow for his 3-day trip to Hungary. The Holy Father is set to stay in Budapest, where more than 3/4 of the population is Christian. Overall, the country is around 40% Catholic. This marks the 41st apostolic journey of his pontificate. EWTN News Vatican Correspondent Colm Flynn joins us now from Rome. Colm, great to see you. So there is a lot of interest in the Holy Father's trip to Hungary. Tell us more about that.
A very good evening, Tracy. And yes, you're right. There is going to be so much interest in this trip for many reasons, but the main one is political. Hungary, with its Prime Minister Viktor Orban, is seen as a strong conservative nation within a mainly liberal Europe. And so this has resulted in them having a very delicate and often difficult relationship with the European Union. For example, at the moment, 15 EU governments are taking legal action against Hungary because of a law there being passed, which Hungary says will help protect children against gender ideologies. The EU and other nations are saying that it's anti-LGBTQ and even an assault on human rights. So while Pope Francis and Viktor Orban might not see eye to eye on other topics, this is one they actually do agree on. The Pope has spoken out strongly a number of times against the EU's gender ideology, for example, saying back in 2016 that it goes against nature. So that is one point the Pope and the Hungarian Prime Minister both agree on. Another issue where their viewpoints may not fully align is on the issue of immigrants and refugees. The Pope, from the very beginning of his papacy in 2013, has made it one of his main priorities to highlight the plight and suffering of migrants and refugees, always encouraging countries to open their hearts and their borders to those in need. On the other hand, Prime Minister Viktor Orban has been less receptive to refugees. Back in 2018, for example, during the refugee crisis, he took a very hardline anti-immigration stance. He criticised the EU's policy on immigration, saying that it threatened the sovereignty and cultural identity of Hungary. He also said he didn't see them as Muslim refugees, but more as Muslim invaders.
But Colm, I understand Hungary has opened its doors to some refugees.
That's right, Tracy, because since the war started in Ukraine, Hungary has welcomed thousands of refugees into its country, and they've been allowed to stay, they've been given help and protection. And in fact, in 2022, Viktor Orban came here to the Vatican, where Pope Francis thanked him for opening his borders to Ukrainian refugees. And Tracy, there was this kind of awkward or funny moment where Pope Francis presented the Prime Minister with a medal of St. Martin, and he pointed out that St. Martin gave his cloak to a person in need. And then Viktor Orban was quick to respond and point out to the Pope that he didn't give his whole cloak, he only gave half of it. So many believe there is this point of conflict between the two when it comes to just how open a country should be to the amount of refugees they take in. The Pope has said many times that we have to build bridges, not walls, but he did also say that these bridges had to be built wisely. Now, Tracy, on the topic of Ukraine, this is another area where there may be some friction between the two. Pope Francis speaking out against the war, condemning Russia at every turn. Viktor Orban less vocally critical of President Putin and Russia. In fact, they criticize EU sanctions on Russia, while at the same hand, Hungary has been calling for the de-escalation of the situation. But remember, Tracy, Hungary, very much a Catholic country. They hosted the Eucharistic Congress 2 years ago, and it is believed that Pope Francis will get a warm welcome when he lands in Budapest tomorrow. Viktor Orban travelled here to Rome to pay his respects and kneel and pray before the body of Pope Benedict XVI after he passed away. So there is a strong historical relationship between the nation of Hungary and the Holy See.
Colm, almost out of time, but quickly, I know the Vatican has just released an updated version of the Holy Father's schedule. What more can you tell us about his plans?
Well, during the first day, as usual, the Pope will meet the President of the Republic and the Prime Minister. At the same time, he will address the diplomatic corps. Then in the afternoon, he will meet local clergy. On Saturday, the Holy Father will meet refugees and the poor, also young people and, as is normal on these trips, the Jesuit community. On Sunday, his last day in Budapest, Pope Francis will preside at Mass at Kossuth-Lajos Square. And then in the afternoon, before returning to Rome, there will be a meeting with people from the academic and cultural world. Tracy?
Okay, Colm, thank you so much. Appreciate that report. Up next on EWTN News Nightly, a new version of Moneyball. We dive into the controversy over gambling in sports. Well, the National Football League recently suspended 5 players for gambling. 3 were banned until next season, at least for betting on football. 2 others were suspended for placing bets on non-football games at team facilities. This as the NFL has embraced legalized wagering as a major source of revenue. It even has a franchise, the Las Vegas Raiders, that plays near world-famous casinos. We go now to sports agent Doug Eldridge, founder of DLE Agency and Achilles Public Relations. Doug, great to have you back on. Some say the suspensions by the NFL are hypocritical given how much the league has embraced legalized gambling. But, others say the bans are really important for the integrity of pro football. I'm curious, what's your take?
Well, it really is in many ways a tightrope that the league has to walk. They do $16 billion in revenue each year, and they had a record $1.8 billion in revenue this past year, and a big chunk of that, Tracy, was actually from the official sports betting partnerships. Now, good for thee, not for me. We hear that phrase bandied about a lot, and I'm not going to throw the lawn darts of hypocrisy, but here's where it becomes a tightrope. On one hand, they have a multi-billion-dollar revenue stream through legalized betting in the wake of the 2018 SCOTUS decision. But on the other hand, the employees of the NFL, the more than 1,500 players that make up the league, they really have a very simple but very stringent code of conduct when it comes to sports gambling. No wagers can be made on any league or team property or event. So the locker room, the team bus, the plane, the field, things along those lines. Secondly, no wagers can be made on any NFL games. Now, these 5 players that were punished last week, 3 of whom got indefinite suspensions, which means they're out for at least a year, and then have to petition to be readmitted, and the other 2 got 6 games. They violated that simple but strict and stringent and arguably scathing mandate when it comes to betting. I think that there was a little bit of punitive instinct in this. In other words, we want to send a very clear message by making a very clear example of these 5 players, because the last thing that we want to have to do as a league is to implement punishment related to a revenue stream. So they went hard on those guys for a reason, and they definitely got in a pound of flesh in the process.
Yeah, Doug, also in the news recently, 7 U.S. professional sports leagues joined NBC Universal and Fox to help ensure a, quote, responsible approach to sports betting ads. What will this approach look like, do you think? And what does it signal that these leagues and networks really felt compelled to address sports betting?
Well, I think it makes sense. And in many ways, Tracy, it's almost an acknowledgement of the evolution and legitimacy of this, not only as a business, but as a multi-billion-dollar industry, right? Just like there are advertising guidelines or really restrictions insofar as how alcohol or cigarettes or firearms are marketed, not only across the United States, but specifically with age restrictions, but also compliance restrictions in terms of messaging, et cetera. So it makes sense that they would do this from a legal standpoint, from a financial standpoint, and essentially from a regulatory standpoint. But when you back out to 50,000 feet, in many ways, this is a vice. And so what they're trying to do is really establish rumble strips in the hopes that the messaging and the inevitable consumption of this won't go off the road, or at least if and when it does, they can say, prophylactically, we implemented standards and codes of conduct so that we knew that we were responsibly messaging this to our target audience. How that was ultimately received, caveat emptor, buyer beware. So it makes sense that they would do it, and I'm glad that they're doing it.
Yeah, Doug, and I know you represent professional athletes in several sports, including pro football. Do you find yourself, talking with them about gambling maybe more than you did a few years ago? And if so, what's your message to them?
I do. I mean, for example, look at this Super Bowl. Look at this recent March Madness just last month. An estimated 30 million Americans, 1 in 10, assuming, for the sake of round numbers, 300 million, 330 million in this country, basically 1 in 10 Americans were going to make some form of wager, not necessarily on a gambling app, even if it was just a backyard bet or an office pool, something along those lines. 1 in 10. So gambling has always been there, but it's always been kind of the sort of Damocles. I say all of that to say that when you have clients all over the country and all over the world, and they have the ability to make a wager in the palm of their hand at a red light or sitting at an airport gate, The temptation is always there. But what I say to them is, look, you've worked your entire life to get to this point. You have earned every penny of every dollar you have ever made. Why would you squander it? Just from an asset management standpoint, but then especially in the NFL, guys, it is so difficult to get in, and it is even harder to stay in. Why would we do anything that would risk our career? You have the rest of your life to gamble if you so choose. For the narrow window, the average career in the NFL is 3 years. Why on earth would we even contemplate this?
Absolutely, Doug. Thanks so much for coming on and weighing in. Always appreciate your insights. And we thank you for watching tonight. Remember, you can follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at EWTN News Nightly. I'm Tracy Sable. Good night and God bless.